Welcome to another episode of Tax Leaders Unplugged. Our guest today is Sara Spring. And Sara is the head of tax at Oatly. Before, she was the head of tax and treasury at Anicura. And Sara has had multiple other in-house roles at, among others, GSK, General Mills, and many more. Sara has a finance and accounting background and transitioned early in her career into tax, and she's based in Stockholm, Sweden. In this episode, we will discuss the remarkable career path of Sara, going from accountancy to head of tax and all the learnings that can be derived from this and much more. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Stevie.
I'm a true follower or a happy follower of you on LinkedIn, and I see all of the things you're posting. And I must say that I'm impressed about the wide range of hobbies and interests you have, because I've seen posts around horse riding, CrossFit, Olympic weightlifting, skiing, and much more. Tell us a bit about all of this and whether there is one common theme across all of those different hobbies.
Well, there definitely is. I like a challenge. I love learning new things. And it needs to be a little bit difficult. So I started learning when I was a few months old, really, learning horse riding, that is. So my mom had horses. She's had horses my entire life. So she'd put me up on a horse and I'd love it. And I just stuck to it. But throughout my horse riding career, if you'd call it, or life, I always picked the horses that no one else wanted to ride. It had to be something challenging. It has to be, oh, there's a risk of falling off, or there needs to be a bit of speed, or there needs to be a challenge. So obviously dressage wasn't quite for me. I went straight into show jumping, and I wanted it to be fast and quick and a little bit scary. So kind of the opposite of my professional career, where I really do not like the risk. On the hobby side, it's the complete opposite. So I only recently took up skiing. I've done cross-country skiing as a kid, never did alpine or downhill, so to say. So I think it's now 4 or 5 weeks ago, me and my oldest son, 5.5 years old, started skiing. Learning as a 40 plus is not easy, but it gets the adrenaline going for sure. I guess that's kind of the same. Yeah.
So it's a combination of a bit of adventure, risk, and then the continuous learning that you want to get out of it. I like that. Any other things you see yourself doing in the future?
Sports-wise, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, this autumn, my oldest son again, he's a real adventurer. He started top rope climbing. So when you climb with a rope and you go up the walls and that. So he loved it. So obviously I had to get the green card to be able to secure him and all of that, which meant I started climbing as well. So that's another new hobby that I've started, but who knows what comes up next.
Well, that's
time will tell.
Yeah, impressive. And I like that there is a bit of common ground in the things that I also like in my private life. So that's good to hear. I looked at your resume as well, and what I identified is that you have worked in very different industries, like very wide area of different industries, in different countries as well, different roles. What was so far the main driver throughout your career, which brought you from one gig to another, from one country to another? Can you explain that?
Well, to be honest, there's a few of them, but I think, again, the main one here is there needs to be a route for development. And for some reason, I'm drawn to dynamic environments. So even when I worked for bigger, stable organizations, they've normally gone through a period of transition. They've gone through a restructuring. There's something happening that excites me. Now, going from accounting into tax, that was not a deliberate choice originally. So that was something that my first role working was a mix of the two. And the first thing I started going into, I started a new project, very junior, obviously, in TP. And at that point, I didn't even consider it to be a tax topic. It was just something I needed to be able to manage the cross-charging between entities and countries. So there's always been that drive for change and to organize chaos in a way. Chaos, obviously taken lightly, it doesn't have to be actual chaos, but it needs to be a little bit messy for me to kind of roll my sleeves up and get cracking on it. So you'll see that in every role I've had, which eventually led me to, I was in a permanent position, but I saw the company I was in wasn't doing too well. And at one point we had to let go of half the workforce. And I was doing accounting and tax in that role too. And I realized that even though I like stability, I don't like risk in my professional life, as I mentioned, this wasn't stable anymore. And at that particular moment, I was headhunted as a contractor for another firm. So I kind of went, I'm not the contracting type, because it means I don't know what I'll be doing tomorrow or in a week or a month or whatever. But I went into that, and that kind of led me to, experiencing more different industries, different companies, different dynamics, different setups of businesses. So when I eventually went permanent again, I can't remember how many years, but a number of years later, I was terrified that I'd get bored to death in this new job, right? And that was for Anikura. I was absolutely terrified that I'd go in there and 3 months in, I'd feel like I'm doing the same thing day in and day out, and I'd get bored and have to leave and do contracting again. But that didn't happen. So I think that's when I started looking back and saying, right, if I look at what I've done historically and what I've actually enjoyed, it's always been the tax side, which obviously at that point I had already transitioned into tax fully since a number of years back. But it had always been the tax side, and it had always been the dynamic part of it, the working between organizations, working with internal and external stakeholders, and kind of contributing value where it was just messy, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. You make that distinction, or you refer to being as a contractor versus permanent or on the payroll, I will say. What is your experience there, and do you expect that in this day and age there's more need for contractors versus on payroll? You have lived in on both sides.
I think the main difference is the type of roles you'd go for. As a permanent employee, you can kind of go for a role where you can already see that you don't really know all of it. You know less in a permanent role than you do in a contracting role, because in a contracting role, they'd expect you to come in and just go, hit the ground running.
Yeah.
So there's no room for official development, if we can call it that. Whilst in a permanent role, I'd consider it that if you already know everything, you've outgrown that role already. So you need to go for something that's a little bit more challenging. So I think that's the main thing. But when it comes to what's going to happen, what should you aim for? I think it depends on the country. Like in Sweden, it's hard to get rid of people. So people obviously want to be employed to a large extent, also considering the tax climate. But companies may urge for, a contractor instead until they know they actually need a role, because if they're not entirely sure, they might be stuck with more personnel than they need. And then you have other countries where it's the complete opposite. So
Yeah.
it very much depends on the landscape, I'd say.
Yeah. I'm of course looking from a Belgian angle, and there is a bit of flexibility, which is not that common if you look at the countries around us, where you can be a contractor and you can be on payroll with some degree of flexibility. Obviously, there are rules that you need to live with, but I know in other countries like the UK, the rules are very strict. I do see, however, that more and more people show up on my LinkedIn as interim managers, as contractors, probably looking for a bit more of variation, a bit more of flexibility, a bit more of hopping between careers. But I find it interesting to see in this day and age. Looking at the different countries in which you worked, any differences, any highlights or lowlights you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I've gone through the wide array of cultures, really. I'd say on the extremes, if we can call it that, we've got the Netherlands, where people are very direct and straightforward, and they say what they're thinking, whether it's appropriate or not, which to some extent I really appreciate, because you know where you have people. And on the other side of that, you've got the UK, where, if there's an error in an Excel file you've sent to someone, then they'll ask you to, may you please have another look at this spreadsheet, because there may be issues. If that happened in the Netherlands, they would have said, well, that's wrong on cell D34, whatever. Can you have a look at that? So that's kind of the difference. It's one of them being very polite and appropriate, while the other one is a bit more direct and to the point. So I think moving between countries, even if it's, within similar roles or industries or various industries or roles, you just need to be a bit aware, of the culture. But I like the direct style. But having lived in the UK for many years, and obviously my husband's a Brit as well, you get used to both. And you can kind of use both to your advantage. So some situations call for you being a bit more direct, and others you kind of need to step back and be a little bit more mellow in your delivery.
And what about Sweden? What would you say? Is it more direct or more like the UK?
It's an interesting blend, I'd say. I'm Swedish originally, so having lived abroad, I'm probably spent 14 years of my life abroad. I've only been back to Sweden for 7 years now. So my entire working life prior to that was abroad. So I've been shaped by that to a degree. So I have the directness, I've had the British politeness to a degree, and I've got other things I've picked up in Italy and Greece and so forth. But I think the Swedes, we are direct, but we're also a little bit scared of confrontation, generally speaking. And that can pose some interesting challenges at times, for sure. So you want to say something and you may say it, but then that turns into a conflict and you want to back out of it. So it becomes an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. All right, cool. Looking at your resume, so as said, you started your career in finance and accounting, then moved to tax accounting, then right now you are in tax leadership. Along the way, you also had some involvement in treasury. Tell us a bit, like starting with the very beginning of your career in finance and accounting, how you then, because you already explained the TP side of things, moved you up a bit towards tax. But tell us that journey, and also mostly what are those learnings that you have from your financial background, which now in your tax leadership role come as a benefit or make you look at things differently than purely trained tax people?
That's an interesting question. I think the main part here is that you need to be interested to learn whatever you're doing. And coming into finance and accounting as a very junior person, the first few things that I looked at, as I mentioned, was I realized there was no control on the TP. We didn't know what we were charging to where. We somehow got it right anyway, but there was no structure, there was no list, there was no documentation showing this is why we're using this tax code for VAT, this is why we're doing it this way for that country, this is why we document these things for that specific entity, and so forth. So the first thing I did was to obviously work on that and make my own life easier. That was the intention with that. The other side of it was basically I needed to make sense of the figures I was looking at. So why are we charging all of these things across the countries? Why is it different for VAT? Because there's a lot of things that link accounting and finance and tax together. So that was kind of the key there. Moving through to tax accounting, what ended up happening was that the tax side was always what I was good at, even though that wasn't what I was trained in. So I was good at it and I was interested in it, which meant I developed quicker on the tax side than I did on the accounting side. Because the accounting side was, well, debit, credit, book it here, book it there. And I was kind of, yeah, okay. And now there's a financial statement again. So I didn't see the attractiveness of the accounting as much as I did with the tax. So every role from then on was a mix of tax and accounting, where the tax side quite quickly took over almost entirely until all of a sudden I woke up one day and I was a tax professional. Not by choice, but by accident, I guess we could call it. When it comes to how that's enabled me to look at things, I think I look at it from various perspectives. So it's not only looking at it through the accounting lens or the finance lens or the treasury lens or the tax lens. I can look at it from different angles and kind of find the common goal in an issue. So it becomes easier for me to work with people from marketing, for example, or people from business development or whatever it might be, because I can see their side of things. So that's definitely helped in shaping who I am as a tax leader. The other thing is that you probably heard this, the bad reputation of tax, where don't ask tax, they'll always say no. I don't want to be the person that says no. I want to be the person that says yes. And here is the list of the consequences that I would have, so that people learn why they should or shouldn't do certain things. But it's not necessarily up to me to say, no, you can't do that. I want them to understand why they shouldn't do it. So I think that's something that helps me in developing the relationship with them as well, and kind of make tax efficient in that sense. So working with the different departments becomes easier with my background because I've been there. I've done an MBA. I've worked in accounting. I've worked in finance. I've worked in treasury. I've even done AP at one point as a side job when I was studying. So, you need to understand what it looks like from the very bottom to fully be able to integrate that at the higher levels. So I think that's kind of the key here.
I want to pick that quote where you said, like, I don't want to be the person that says no. I want to be the person that says yes. I've been guilty myself. Like, I worked over a decade in-house, and I will say I definitely blocked sometimes business ideas, M&A deals or whatever, because I was looking from a tax perspective at all of the risks or all of the blocking factors. What are like very practical recommendations you would have for other tax leaders, people in the audience, to become much more of a person that supports the business and not being that business blocker? Any things you can share here? Because obviously your background, true, that's relevant. You have a bit of experience with finance, accounting. You said treasury, so you have that experience and that background that helps you to probably put yourself in their shoes a bit more. But anything else you can think of?
Well, I have one pet peeve, a massive pet peeve when it comes to tax people, is that when we speak with each other, we speak tax. So someone comes in and you hear about the DEMPI analysis and you hear about, Pillar 2 and whatever else it could be, BEPS, you name it. And someone not in tax, it just goes over their head. They don't know what we're talking about. But it's fine to do that to another tax person. But if you're talking to a CFO, CEO, to a marketing professional or an accounting manager, if you start rambling about DEMPI, they don't know what's going on. You can't do that. You need to speak their language with them. Same as I wouldn't sit here and speak Swedish to you because you wouldn't get it. I can't sit here and speak tax to someone not in tax. So you need to kind of see it as a language rather than as a department, if that makes sense. So it's more about speaking a language they understand so that you can get them on your side and they can see what the issue may be. And to be frank, Stevie, we all need to say no sometimes. We need to put down the foot and say, no, that's it. Because it's not always that even when they have understood the reasons that they agree with it, they may think that, well, my business reason weighs heavier than the tax risk, but it's a tax risk we just cannot afford to take or are not willing to take. Then you still have to put your foot down and say, well, no, if you're not going to make the right decision here, then I will. And this is the reason why. So I think there needs to be a balance as well. But the key thing here is you cannot speak tax to non-tax people. You shouldn't speak tax to non-tax people.
That is very clear. What about having your seat at the table? What about making sure that you are being asked for your tax opinion at all? Any practical advice there?
Put your nose where they don't want it is basically what I've done. And I guess that comes a little bit from my years in the Netherlands, where you just kind of, if you need to, you push your way in. But obviously the ideal situation is where they start seeing what value you can contribute with. They consider you a strategic business partner and you get invited anyway. But sometimes, depending on the organization, it takes time to get there. So being, I was, 20 odd something when I started working in accounting and tax. And I worked with mainly older white men, 40, 50, 60 plus. It's hard to kind of make a mark and say, listen to me, I've read this book, or I know this from uni, or whatever it might, because I didn't have any experience, right? Why would they listen to me? They worked for this for 20, 30, 40 years. So you kind of need to be very persistent You need to point at facts. And you need to say, oh, there's a meeting on that. Like, scan their calendars. I did that with my managers all the time. What meetings do they have? That one I can get involved in, or that one I'd like to hear more about. Obviously, some of that will come out of your free time because you also have a full-time job to do, which may not include a 3-hour meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, right? So you need to have that interest. You need to say, can I come to that meeting? Or I am coming with you to that meeting. And unless there's something very confidential that you can't hear, don't give up. Like, keep pushing. I need to know. I need to understand how this works and list whatever reasons you may have that link back to your role and how you can contribute if you actually understand it.
I like that.
So that's
yeah. I like that, being a bit pushy and having your foot in the door. Do you also then tell your team today that they should have that attitude?
Absolutely. And if they are told no, they can't attend, then I want to know why they can't attend. So, I mean, the thing we work according to in my team is that if it's tax related, the odds are we're aware because 10, 15 different people come and tell us, listen, there's a tax issue. Well, fantastic. We're probably already on top of that because, well, we had other 5, 6 people already tell us last week, right? If it's not tax related, say they're merging an entity, they're creating a new one, or they need to fund an entity abroad and they're doing it by debt or equity, whatever it might be, it has tax consequences. So if you haven't considered tax there, then that's a problem. So if it's not tax related to the general public, then I want to know about it because likelihood is that it actually has a tax impact. So I try to attend meetings where I'm not invited originally. Sometimes popular, sometimes not, but I'm happy to take that. And I think throughout my career, I've kind of made a mark that, in those meetings where I didn't need to be according to the business, that's where I've actually made a real difference. So yeah, it speaks for something for sure.
Oh, I like that. Because I think in general, every business decision has a tax shadow, right? So we all know that. So you need to be aware of what's going on. And I wonder, like, so if you go to a meeting where you're not invited, if you're there, do you then present yourself a bit and say like, hey, I'm Sara, I represent tax. I'm just here listening in to see whether we don't oversee any tax implications, or how do you typically do that? Just to share with the audience, what are good tips to behave in such a meeting?
Yeah, well, it was easier before COVID when there was an actual office and you could just open the door because you knew the meeting was happening. Today, you need a Teams link to log on to that meeting and you need an invite, right? So now it's more about actually socializing, hearing from people, what are you working on? What are the projects going on in the business right now? What are the topics that are coming in? When you read your emails, don't only read the section that's addressed to you, because sometimes they'll tag you with an at and they say, Sara, can you have a look at this bit? Read the rest of it, read the history, or ask AI to summarize for you if you don't have the time. There could be keys in there that links into other projects or other decisions that are being made, which have a tax nature, but that they haven't realized has a tax nature to it. So obviously, when you then say, hang on, if we're doing this, that could have a tax impact. Can we have a short call on this, or can I participate in that meeting? It's very rare that people say, no, you cannot. It's very, very rare. I rarely get that, to be honest with you. And I don't think my team does either, at least not that I'm aware of. The other thing is, you mentioned tax shadow. That's another thing, that a shadow comes after you, right? First you arrive and then the shadow is behind you. That shouldn't be the case, because tax needs to be part of the original decision. We shouldn't be the sweeping up the issues once they've already happened. So say, like an example, we're funding this for an entity, right? Should we do it with debt or equity? If you make the decision and then you inform tax, there is very little we can do to tax optimize this or to have an impact on that decision. If we work as a strategic business partner instead, and we actually get consulted before you decide on debt or equity, then we can make an impact. Otherwise, we're just sweeping up the issues, right? We're trying to fix something that we could have fixed better if we were involved from the beginning.
I like that, because I've been using that a lot, the tax shadow, let's say, analogy, but it makes tax look as an afterthought, whereas it should definitely be not. So no, thanks for bringing that up. You also said that you referred to the beginning of your career where, as a young tax professional, you sometimes had difficulties to be heard in the room. Was that just because you were young, or was it also because you are a young woman in maybe an, let's say, world which tax finance typically is or was dominated by men?
I think it's both. And I think, now we're looking back 20 odd years where it was slightly different. And even though I'd still say we're quite equal in the workplace today, men and women, there are differences, not mentioning the pay gap here because that's not the topic, but looking at what you need to do to progress, what do you need to do to be taken seriously. For me to be taken seriously, it takes a lot more than if a male colleague my age had done the same thing. So I was frenetically reading tax legislation and case studies and law and, you name it, anything I could get my hands on, I would read up on. If I had a topic at work where I didn't fully get it, or, I needed more on my feet, I would frenetically sit and go through all of the information. So when I was challenged on something, well, where did you get that from? We've never heard that. That's not how it works. You don't understand tax. Oh, okay, well, this case from whatever year, or European Commission ruled in that case, this and that. Point out the facts. It's very hard to argue with facts. The other thing is be persistent, but be gentle with it, I think. So let them know that you have your standpoint, but, if someone overrides you and say, well, I understand, but this is what we're doing. Okay, that's what we're doing. You've said your piece, you move ahead. And when you run into issues that are caused because it was done in a certain way that went against what you had wanted to do, then you can bring that up and say, I've ran into this issue. And then you can gently point towards if we go with this other option now, then maybe we can avoid that. So there's certain ways of doing that. But I think the main thing is make sure they understand that you understand and you base your knowledge and decisions on actual current facts. It's not that you read a book at uni or there was a professor 20 years ago that told you something. It needs to be, facts, literally. That's what works. But also don't cave in, stand your ground, because it can be intimidating if, for me, a 60-year-old male tells me that you don't understand how this works. Then, okay, right. I can feel intimidated by that, but do I need to step back and not have my opinion because of that? No, I do not. So I think that's the big difference there, that stand your ground, be gentle about it, but, you don't need to change your mind because they say so.
Oh, and I would say that very often it is gray, right? So you can have different opinions because the truth is somewhere in the middle. Because in tax, it's very often not black or white, it's gray, it's not binary. If you read a piece of legislation and I do, we may have a different interpretation, right?
Exactly. And that's the part I really love about tax, because everyone thinks it's black and white. You tick a few boxes, you calculate plus minus this, there's a fixed number, there is no, nuances in this area. That's kind of the opposite of the truth, because it's all a gray area. There's all interpretations, there's all different case law, different case studies, different jurisdictions. So there's so many opinions involved in making a tax decision, and it's not black and white. It's so far from it. And I don't think people outside of tax really understand that.
That is definitely true. And that might also be probably a reason why we still have a bright future as tax professionals. Because on the one hand, the legislation as it stands is complex, but also there is a tendency that the new types of legislation only gets more complex. If we look at Pillar 2 or the likes, it's not getting, let's say, it's more straightforward. It's always getting more complex. And to your point, it's then a combination of having the legislation, maybe the preparatory works to that legislation, then there is doctrine, then there is case law. All of it together should be then understood and applied. And that makes that probably it's a very, very protected profession in itself, which maybe brings me to a topic which obviously is top of mind for all of us. And I'm curious what your view is on this. You obviously as the head of tax at Oatly. I love the company, by the way. So high growth, all over the place, amazing brand. So I assume very forward thinking in general, very much about or ahead of the transformation pack, and very tech savvy. Tell me a bit like what are you currently doing when it comes to, let's say, initiatives to transform your function, applying next generation technologies, and then obviously the elephant in the room, AI.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was never the one to buy the first iPhone when it came out, right? I want to see how people use it first, how it works, before I jump on that bandwagon. Now, contrary to my grandfather, who actually got the first iPhone thinking, oh, this is cool, he's always been the one that got the technology when it came out, and he'd get it. And I vividly remember him coming over to our house one day when I still lived with my mom, and he had the first iPhone in his pocket, and he showed me and he said, look at this. This is the future, Sara. And I said, right. And I touched and I said, how does it work then? Because it's just a black screen. He goes, yeah, I haven't figured out how to turn it on yet. So he's been walking around with this iPhone in his pocket for 3 weeks. He had no idea how to turn it on. So that's the opposite of where I am, right? I want to know how it works. I want to know what are the hiccups and all of that before I jump on it. Now with AI, it's developed so quickly that there's really no option of not going into it. So what we're working with at Oatly right now is we're implementing a tool for VAT, mainly to automate VAT. That's something that's been around for many years, obviously, and there's big providers, there's small providers and whatnot. So that's the first step on the technical journey for us in tax. The other thing that you're probably aware of, Stevie, that we looked at is log tax, to kind of have that oversight and say, cash tax positions and information that could answer questions that I get from our CFO regularly that today takes me a lot of time to get on top of. But I think the main thing here, and head of IT would be very happy about this question, by the way, Stevie. So I think the main point is here, we have an AI policy. We are encouraged to use it in safe manners. So we're definitely keeping our eyes open on looking at, what could we do internally? How could we make tax more efficient? And one thing that keeps kind of nagging me a little bit is the thought that what we're doing now, the returns that we're submitting now, would it be CIT returns, VAT, easy sales list, wherever it could be, right? All of those reports, you have however long statute of limitations to look at that as a tax authority. And say 6 years into the future, they pick up our VAT return from today, which we've done through systems and manual and whatnot, partially AI, but not fully integrated yet. They're 6 years into the future, looking at that with AI tools that could pick up the slightest little issue that you cannot catch today unless you go through every single invoice, right? So I'm sure every company has this as well, because there's millions of transactions in an organization per period, right? You can't possibly look at all of them individually. You have systems that help you identify, here could be an issue, there's a flag here, that's possibly the wrong tax code, this is sitting on a sensitive GL account, wherever it could be. All of these reports that we submit today are going to be scrutinized years into the future by the tax authorities, when the tools are much more advanced than what we have today. So we need to be so detailed in how we're doing things. We need to be so rigid in our controls that we catch the slightest little issue, which for them will take, the press of a button in 6 years' time. So that's a little bit terrifying, I find.
Yep, I agree. And it's that combination of combining, let's say, everything you have on your VAT return with your stat accounts, with your corporate tax return, with maybe what you say in your local file, and CBCR and Pillar 2 and whatnot, where I think that the tax authorities, they all get it on a silver plate, because you typically do e-filings, so they get it in a nice format, digitally, where it should be. They can also exchange information internationally, right? So they have a pretty good view about multinationals and what they are doing, whereas the same is not always true for the multinational itself. Are there any specific initiatives that you are now rolling out, or how you are instructing your team to get there in a better shape? You referred already to the indirect tax side of things, but what are in your eyes the most pressing things to do there? Or how are you in general also encouraging your team to try out new stuff and always keep on progressing?
We're always having an eye on what are the possibilities out there. What could we do with AI? What could we do with technology? But it's also a matter of what could we do with the existing systems that we have, because just because you have a system that when you implemented it however many years ago it did not utilize AI, it doesn't mean that they don't today. So there's also a lot of possibilities within the systems that you already have within the organization. So I work very closely with other departments, mainly accounting. They use obviously the ERP systems and other systems that develop very quickly. So the things that they use, there's also possibilities of using BI, for example, and similar reports where you could utilize what they've optimized for them and repurpose that for tax and add some twists and whatever it might need to be, to make sure that you're in better control. Now, most of my career I've worked for international businesses. I think all of my career, actually, I don't have a single company on my resume that is in one country. But that adds the challenge of, you mirror the reporting, right? So if you're looking at, as an example, easy sales, where you report per VAT registration how much you've sold to a foreign European party, that needs to be mirrored on the other side. So if you've sold goods, for example, that needs to be mirrored on the intrastat. So you may have that amount in the dispatches, while the other country should have the same amount in arrivals. If there's a mismatch there, then you've got an issue. So, that's another piece of the puzzle that we're looking at to make sure that everything matches. And if there's something that doesn't match, we need to find a way of fixing that. Most of the time that would come from, historically master data or whatever. It could be like an incorrect setup, or there's been changes to systems that mean that things don't work the way they used to. So again, this is where it's important to always consult tax when you go in and change things in the system, because you may not realize it has an impact on reporting for tax, but tax will realize that. So the international connection and the mirrored reporting, as I call it, is another focus area to make sure that it continues to match throughout time, regardless of what changes we make to systems.
We have one person in the team that is tasked with pushing all of this, or is this a shared responsibility of every tax team member? And does it go beyond tax?
It goes beyond tax, obviously. There is, as I mentioned, there's an AI policy and there's advances being made on technology all the time. Having said that, the tax team, and this is something I'm quite used to, is tiny. So it's me, It's one more person who's a senior manager for group tax. And then we're working with 2 students at the moment. So they're currently studying tax and they're trying to get into the tax profession, but they're still at uni. So they're doing hours for us. So that's it. There's the 4 of us. At Anikura, it was just me, myself, and I. And then I ended up building the tax team, tax and treasury team, I should say. So at the end, there was 5 of us, myself included. But tax teams, as you know, Stevie, there's the budgets shrink and the demands increase. So it's hard to make it work. You need to focus on what actually makes a difference.
Yeah, and their technology will be the only way forward, because to your point, teams, budgets, resources under continuous pressure. At the same time, amount of work only going up, right? That is the sad reality in which we live as tax people, which is sometimes not well understood by the CFO, because we get compared with maybe treasury or finance, which I think workload-wise are pretty stable.
Yeah.
But from a tax perspective, it's more regulations, changes all over the place, stricter deadlines, higher penalties, etc., which make it sometimes hard to get the resources we need. By the way, any concrete recommendations you have for the audience here, how you successfully defended towards your CFO or budget owner to get the resources you need?
No.
That's honest.
It's a hard one, right? I mean, as you know, I tried to get log tax on board there are different priorities within a business, and tax is not the center of the world unless you're a tax consultancy, which we're not. Looking back at other companies as well, like you can only do so much in defending a budget and doing what you can, and you can also try to negotiate with the provider. Obviously, can you cut the cost the first few years so we can really show the value of this tool and so forth. But it's also up to you to create the budget. What other cost cuttings could you make? Could you bring stuff in-house that are actually paying someone else to do externally because it's easier for you? But you could bring them in-house and save thousands, for example. Because let's face it, a headcount normally costs less than having advisors do a lot of your external reporting for you. So it's just a balancing act there of finding the right goal, really. And depending on where the business is in their objectives as well, there's, believe it or not, things that go before tax, even though we are important. As I keep telling the business that, the business didn't start because of tax, but if we don't do it right, it could end with it. So that's also a perspective to have with you when you argue for something that, to be compliant is one thing, because obviously there's a requirement to be compliant. There's no negotiation on that. You need the budget to be compliant, end of. And that's never a conversation I've had to have. Compliance is a priority for every CFO on the planet. But when it comes to the fancier nice to haves, this could save us some time. That's harder to get budget for.
Yeah, I hear that regularly, that CFOs, they just want to hear, has everything been filed? Has everything been paid? If so, I don't want to hear you anymore. Bye. But at the same time, obviously, you want to continuously, get more done with less. You want to support the business. You want to make sure that you maybe, in a timely fashion, identify risks, spot opportunities. And for that, you need the resources. So I hear you. In general, throughout your career, any differences you have seen based on industries or countries, or do CFOs typically have the same lens when they look at it?
They're very different, I'll say. And during my time at Anakura, I went through 5 CFOs. So that's quite a few. They all, when a new CFO starts, the pattern I've seen is they want to make their mark. They want to make a few changes, and they want to kind of set the tone for this is a new era, which I really appreciate, being someone that likes and sees the positive side of change. But I think there's also quite a big difference in, who they are as a person. And I think this is something that is not necessarily spoken about a lot, but a CFO with technical skills can be really good on paper, but if they do not have the personality to match and to motivate the team and to keep them moving forward, then that's not actually going to have an impact. And I've seen both sides of this. I've worked with CFOs many years ago that, were less good on the soft skills, but really good technically. So they drove great results for the business, but the team was leaking, right? So they had a lot of turnover of staff, and people were not necessarily happy. They didn't feel motivated. They didn't see how they contributed and so forth. And then I've also had really good CFOs where, you have a 5-minute conversation with them and you just get that spark to do more, to do better, to improve. And there's a very big difference between those, even though they're technically the same, right? They might have the same skill set. And I think that's the other side of being a woman in tax. You have a different view on it. And something that I've discussed a lot with previous colleagues is there was a business I worked for many years ago where emotional became a bad word. That person is emotional. They can't handle this and that. They can't, it became something negative rather than a positive thing. And I think emotional is normally a word that you'd attribute to a woman rather than to a man. I think this kind of goes against the notion of soft skills in the workplace, because, women have a different view of things. We may have a softer approach. We have empathy to a different level or degree, I'd say. I'm not saying men are not, empathetic. They definitely are. But it's just a different take on things. We view things through a different lens than men do. And sometimes that's what you need, especially in tax, because as we discussed, you can't speak tax to a non-tax person. You need to put yourself in their shoes. You need to nurture your team. And motherly instincts, if anything, come into that nurture part, right? So emotional or feeling the emotions of your team, I consider a positive rather than a negative. Now, being emotional as in, I have outbursts on meetings and that obviously not okay and not great. But being emotionally aware and sensing where your team is at and how they're feeling, I think that's very important to any CFO or tax professional.
Yeah, I do agree. I think in a world where technology is ramping up, the only thing which we as humans probably have more to offer is the emotional intelligence, right? And that's also the only way to get things done from other stakeholders, from your finance colleagues, from the business. So if you don't have that relationship, if you don't have that bonding, then there is no willingness to probably help you out, right? So
No,
I
no,
hear you
exactly.
there. I hear you there, and I guess diversity is then again in the spotlight here, and that makes that best teams they are diverse and they have all of those different angles together, which make them most or highly performant teams.
Exactly. And I think you'll also notice that some conversations at work become a bit of a boys' club uh, challenge, so to say. And I try my best to avoid those. Sometimes it's hard because you get drawn into it and it's the conversation that, they want to be right and they can't be right, but they have to be right because otherwise, how are you going to manage it? And especially very early on in my career, that was challenging because you're then kind of pushed to be in one of the boys rather than to be a woman and to, go for what is natural for you in how to handle a situation. So it's very easy to get drawn into that boys club mentality. So yeah, it's difficult. Is the it's the consensus here. Yeah.
I hear you. As a final question, which I ask to all of the participants here or the guests on the podcast, what is your biggest piece of advice that you would offer to tax professionals that maybe one day want to be in your shoes in tax leadership?
Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, I think is the main thing. Do things that you think you can't do and challenge yourself. It doesn't have to be that you take on tasks that you find too hard, but it needs to be, believe in yourself a little bit more. And if something's uncomfortable, then maybe they should be. Maybe you're, listen to your gut and say, is this the right decision to make? Sometimes it's fear, but sometimes it's actually just a bit nervous about what that could mean. So just go for it. Be comfortable with being uncomfortable is the main piece.
Does that also, do I read that correctly, that if you're too comfortable in your current role, it's maybe time for a change, or is that not necessarily the interpretation of that?
You can also, you don't necessarily need to change roles, but could you level up in a role? Could you take on more difficult tasks? Could you speak to your manager? Could you get involved in projects? Could you contribute in a different manner? So there are things that you can develop with your role and your role at the same time without leaving, right? They could also be, it could be telling you that, yeah, you've done this job for too long now. If you feel everything is becoming repetitive, you're not developing and you are comfortable. Like you don't wake up on Monday feeling a little bit, all right, let's see what we get today. Then, yeah, you probably should swap.
Cool. Lovely stuff. So thanks a lot, Sarah, for the conversation. I liked it a lot. It's plenty of good insights, and I think the audience will agree with that. So thanks a lot for being here. And
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure that we will see each other anytime soon out there.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.